Radio, part of the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are joined by Zone Coverage's Sam Ekstrom. We're going to be talking quite a bit about this Week 1 matchup between the Falcons and the Vikings. We'll also be getting into Matt and I's takes on the Falcons' final roster moves, and of course, answering your mailbag questions towards the end of the show. So, Sam, welcome to the show, my friend. Looking forward to football finally being back, and the Falcons and Vikings kicking off this season this upcoming Sunday.
Yeah, football season's here, fellas. It's a fun time of year. The 53-man rosters, that's kind of the big milestone to end training camp and preseason, and now we get to talk about meaningful football. It's fantastic.
Absolutely.
So, Sam, I'd be remiss if I didn't start off the show here talking a little bit about Gary Kubiak, seeing as though I was a huge advocate for him coming to Atlanta, following Sarkisian's firing. And, needless to say, that didn't work out too well for us. And, Kubiak found himself now in Minnesota co-piloting the Vikings offense with Kevin Stefanski. So, first I want to ask, talk a little bit about Kubiak's influence on the team so far and how things have looked in your eyes there on offense.
Sure. Well, it's a great question. And I think a lot of people here in Minnesota and on the outside really give Kubiak as much credit for this offense as Kevin Stefanski, because Kubiak has a track record. Kubiak's won Super Bowls. He's got decades and decades long of resume, kind of on file. And he is helping kind of guide Kevin Stefanski in this new first time as a full-time play caller role. He's brought in, the wide zone running scheme. He brought in Rick Dennison, the offensive line coach, to help enact that. He brought in Brian Periani, his tight ends coach, who knows exactly the language he's speaking. Clint Kubiak, his son, the quarterback's coach. So it's not just Kubiak, but he brings in 3 assistants that all speak that Kubiak language. So they're all very simpatico in that offensive coach's room. Kevin Stefanski is a super adaptable guy. He grew up in the Vikings organization from age 22 with Brad Childress. He's been there almost 15 years, and he's been a running backs coach, a quarterbacks coach, a tight ends coach. So he can adapt well to what Gary Kubiak is bringing. And we've seen it already, on the field, guys, with the play action, the bootlegs, that one cut and go wide zone running style that the Vikings really had no running game last year. And this is, I think, through 4 preseason games, been pretty evident that they're getting back to the run. Mike Zimmer has asked for it, and Gary Kubiak has delivered. And he's got the staff around him that, I think enables him to sort of be a consultant and an advisor, and he can sit up in the booth and he can advise Stefanski, who's calling plays down on the field. So far, it's been a pretty good partnership. Haven't really encountered adversity yet. Last year they had John DeFilippo as their play caller for 13 games. And towards the end of that, things got really bad with DeFilippo and Zimmer butting heads. So I don't see that happening with Kubiak, but you really don't know the strength of a relationship until you hit that first tipping point, which hasn't happened yet. And I'm sure Vikings fans hope it doesn't happen at any point this year.
Well, on the note of the, new offensive coordinator, and I want to talk a little bit about the quarterback, and sort of from the periphery of sort of listening and seeing what Vikings fans were talking about this offseason, it seemed like a lot of conversation was centered around whether Kirk Cousins is the guy. And I'm just sort of curious, sort of where did you fall on that sort of debate and topic, and sort of how has he looked, thus far this summer in his second year with the Vikings?
Yeah, Kirk Cousins was dealt a pretty tough deck when he came in expected to be the savior. When you're 13-3 and you add a quarterback allegedly of his caliber, I think everybody sort of put the expectations of this Super Bowl bound team on him, and he in no way lived up to it. In fact, all of the flaws that I think people were nervous about really reared their head. The fumbles were an issue, coming up short in big games, not taking as much accountability for his mistakes as you would like. Those all were present last year as the season crumbled. They finished 8-7-1, and Cousins was a big reason why. And even though the stats were glistening on paper, 4,000 yards, 30 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, pretty good. Those who watched the games could easily detect that a lot of that flash kind of came, down by 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. There was a lot of kind of garbage yards built up into that stat line. So the fan base is not necessarily all about Cousins right now. He's got to have a year of redemption. And I think that started out for him by kind of acknowledging some of his flaws, recognizing where he wants to get better, and overall recognizing that he's a 500 quarterback for his career, actually a little bit below that. So he's been a little more humble this year going in. I think he definitely got a reality check last year when things went south so quickly in the second half of the season. And this team's also recognized some of his limitations too, and that he's not a mobile quarterback, he's not an improviser, and probably the best way for him to get around some of that is to get him out of the pocket more and to take the pressure off this offensive line that hasn't been very good, and has a rookie in at the center position now. I think the team recognized some of those limitations. Cousins recognized some of those limitations, and hopefully everybody's going in eyes wide open now as to what Cousins can do. And I think he's definitely equipped more this year to succeed than last year when John DeFilippo just wanted him to throw. And when you have him drop back 45 times a game, some of those mobility issues are going to come out. I think this year is going to be different in that regard.
Another one of the major storylines for the Vikings heading into 2019, much like the Falcons, has been the retooling of their offensive line. Minnesota enters the year having 3 new guys at 3 new spots. They used their first-round pick on NC State center Garrett Bradbury. They moved Pat Elflein to left guard, and they signed Josh Klein from Tennessee to be their right guard. And Sam, I'm just curious what your thoughts on those moves are, and do you still see the offensive line as an area of concern for the Vikings heading into Week 1 against the Falcons?
I think it's always going to be a concern here. This offensive line really hasn't been steadfast since the first Brett Favre year in 2009 when they had Steve Hutchinson and John Sullivan and Bryant McKinney and Phil Lodeholt. I mean, it's been a battle just to get, 5 on the field for 16 games. Injuries have been an issue. Poor evaluation has been an issue. They signed Mike Remmers to a 5-year deal, and that only lasted 2 years. So they're again retooling. Josh Klein was a guy with pretty good pass blocking grades who came in from Tennessee. He spent time with New England with Dante Scarnecchia, so he brings a veteran presence. He replaces Remmers at right guard, and then Bradbury's supposed to be the anchor now. The team absolutely loved him. I think they also loved Chris Lindstrom, by the way. He was another target of theirs, but he got swiped. Garrett Bradbury is supposed to be the rock of this offensive line, but so was Pat Elflein a few years ago. Elflein had very high grades coming in, and after 2 years, because of sort of his deficiencies, he got moved to left guard. And guys, it hasn't been a very smooth transition in my estimation. His preseason was rocky, and the adjustment for him hasn't been as seamless as I think a lot of people would have liked. So that left side with Riley Reif and Pat Elflein, I think, is a little bit shoddy. Certainly, you hope that Bradbury can hold his own, and he's shown so far that kind of mentally he can in terms of the playbook and the calls. Still don't know how he's going to hold up physically against some of those huge nose tackles, but I'd say the strength is the right side of the line right now with Klein and Brian O'Neill, the second-year tackle out of Pittsburgh, is coming off an injury, but he didn't allow a sack last year. So I think there's parts of that line that you can count on improving. There are some question marks, though. Elflein's one of them. Riley Reif is one of them. He's been up and down in 2 years with Minnesota. They did, keep some depth on this team with Drew Samia, the rookie, Dakota Dozier they brought in from the Jets. They have options on the bench, but the starting 5, I think, has yet to prove that they can protect and that they can run block, on a 70 snap per game basis.
Now, on the other side of the ball, with the Vikings defensive line is sort of the opposite story, where they've been sort of a stalwart unit for many, many years and sort of the anchor for one of the best defenses in the league in, the Mike Zimmer era. But I'm sort of curious, what are your thoughts on maybe if that defensive line may not be as much of a strength as it has been in previous years? I've heard talk that, Danielle Hunter might be due to a little bit of a regression season, at least from a sack production standpoint, coming off a season where he had 14 and a half sacks. Obviously, Everson Griffin had, a little bit of a rocky 2018 due to some, personal off-field issues. Linval Joseph is no longer, is on the wrong side of 30 at this point in time. And the Vikings wound up replacing Sheldon Richardson with Shamar Stephen, who's, been a valuable depth and rotational piece for the Vikings in previous years. but I've heard questions whether or not he's a starting caliber player that you want to plug in beside Joseph. I'm curious, do you feel like that's a fair assessment of this unit, that maybe it's not quite the strength that it has been in previous years? Or do you feel like this unit is poised to be just as stout as ever in 2019?
Yeah, I think you've accurately identified some of the sticking points with Vikings fans right now, in that, is Everson Griffin going to get back to the 2017 version of himself that started out the year with 8 straight games, getting a sack? Then last year happened, and Everson misses a month with mental health issues, comes back, wasn't the same. It's like he lost that competitive advantage. By all accounts, he's back to the same Everson. His third preseason game, where he played the most, he looked really, really good. In one-on-ones throughout training camp, he looked really, really good. So I think there's reason to believe he can get back to that guy. He's got less tread on the tires than most 31-year-olds, in that he didn't play a ton his first 4 years in the league. He was a rotational piece. So he didn't start playing full-time until 2014. Danielle Hunter regression. I'm not sure if there, maybe in terms of production, yes, there might be some regression there, just because they're going to have, I think, Everson playing a bigger role. I'm sure they're going to have, things schemed up for their linebackers and their corner blitzes. And Mike Zimmer teams don't usually have big sack number guys. They tend to spread the wealth a bit more. So I could see that from Hunter, but I think he's still going to be pretty impactful. Now, in terms of Joseph, that is a legitimate concern on the inside. Joseph is coming off the worst year of his Vikings career, certainly. And there was a time when he was taking on 2 blockers and still managing to put up tackles for loss and sacks. And we didn't see that last year. He had a bevy of injuries. He tried to address those injuries in the offseason with multiple surgeries, and that set him back in terms of his conditioning. He was rehabbing up until a couple weeks ago, so he doesn't have many live bullets so far this preseason. He's been largely on the rehab field. So I think there's reason to believe they're going to go with more of a rotation at defensive tackle, keep Joseph off his feet too much. They kept 6 defensive tackles on this 53-man roster. So that they're definitely going to rotate there. Shamar Stephen for Sheldon Richardson's a definite downgrade, but the expectation is not for Stephen to play 80% of snaps. He's going to be a first and second down run stopping guy. And then they can bring in some of their inside pass rushers like Jalen Holmes, Hercules Mataafa, the former UDFA out of Washington State. There are players on that defensive line that are sort of untapped that the general public wouldn't know about. Afadio Denebo is going to play at defensive end in his third year with the team. So I think there are some intriguing young pieces there that could rise to the occasion, but there are concerns with the veterans, particularly Griffin and Joseph, whether they're going to be the same.
Okay, Sam, we appreciate your insights on the Vikings for this upcoming matchup. And obviously, we would extend best wishes for the Vikings, except for this week coming up. But go ahead and let the people know where they can find your tweets, what sort of coverage you got coming up on zonecoverage.com.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, if people want to get the Minnesota perspective on what's going on, you can always follow me on Twitter at Sam Ekstrom, and check out zonecoverage.com if you have interest beyond the Vikings. We've got all Minnesota sports there. We've got reporters in all the locker rooms. So really the whole gamut of Minnesota sports. But yeah, check in at Sam Ekstrom if you want sort of the day-to-day happenings of what's going on in the Vikings locker room, what the injury report is going to be tomorrow. We'll get our first glimpse of it. So Vikings should be healthy right now, unless something's occurred in the past week. But yeah, thanks for the opportunity to promote that, and thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah,
No
thanks,
problem,
Sam, for your
man.
time. Appreciate it.
All right,
Yeah,
good luck Sunday.
Have a good night, man.
Mm-hmm.
So, guys, that's Sam Ekstrom. Check him out at Zone Coverage. Check him out on Twitter. I'm at Sam Ekstrom on Twitter. I'm sorry, can't talk tonight. But Matt and I are going to continue the show, and we're going to talk a little bit about the roster. We won't talk much about the final preseason game because no one cares at this point, and we'll sort of get into our own thoughts on this upcoming matchup against the Vikings before we jump into your mailbag questions. If you're watching the show right now on YouTube live with us, by all means, jump in the chat, have some conversations. Towards the end of the show, we might start to do some quick hitters answering some of your questions that you're going to have for us live. So keep those questions coming in the chat. But let's get into the roster stuff, because I think this has really been, a lot of stuff has happened in the last week since Matt and I did our most recent show a week ago. Obviously, the big signing that the Falcons made was re-signing kicker Matt Bryant to a 1-year, $3 million deal on Saturday. He is poised to be the kicker again. The Falcons decided to get rid of the great Blair Walsh and the less than great Giorgio Tavecchio to clear the way for Matt Bryant's triumphant return to Atlanta. So, this was a big sticking point for Falcon fans going back several months now. And it's one of those things where it seems like things are back into place. I'm sure, Matt, you're good on how this situation sort of resolved itself, but give your take on this whole situation.
Yeah, I mean, surprised, because again, we talked a little bit last week about it. Didn't think they'd swallow their pride on this particular issue, or at least not swallow their pride this early in the process. And Dimitrov put out a video on it, and I know me and you had a little bit of a back and forth on how this move can be framed and how we can look at it. And I took the stance of having the glass half full, or the optimistic approach, as I seldom or often do. And I think they do deserve credit, and this should be looked at as a brilliant move. I mean, yes, were they lucky that Bryant was still at the table and available as a free agent? Absolutely. I mean, Matt said it this week that 5 teams checked in with him, and we don't know the names of those teams, and we don't know kind of how in depth those talks got to, but they were absolutely lucky he was still out there. But do they deserve credit for, again, not doubling down on a mistake and foregoing re-signing Bryant? Yes. And this is why I think they do, look like, a genius right now, because they maintain their salary cap flexibility from March through August. And, they were still able to bring back their legendary place kicker before the season started, before things got hairy, and before, it cost them games by having a less than, competent kicker out there. So they didn't lose any regular season games over this. They lost very little money. They actually gained cash. They saved $500,000 in actual cash spending by this move. And then on the cap, it added just an additional $167,000, which is peanuts compared to, in salary cap talk. So, that's why, again, I took the stance that this was a great move. Now, maybe, again, we have disagreements on how long that this was in the works for. But, again, if you take Thomas Dimitrov's words to heart, it sounds like they never closed the door on Matt Bryant. They would have closed the door had Giorgio Tavecchio been able to continue his play from last regular season, but that wasn't the case. So the door crept further and further open, and that's why we have Matt Bryant back kicking in Atlanta for 2019.
Okay. Look, when you say genius, that's where
I know it's probably it's probably a harsh term, or a little excessive, but
I mean, look, you're right. We did talk about this last week, and we were both basically saying like they're probably just gonna have Giorgio Tavecchio kick for them week 1, and if he kicks well, they'll roll with him until he struggles, and they'll probably swallow their or not swallow their pride and decide to continue to move past Matt Bryant. He'll wind up going to Carolina or someplace or like that. So that was certainly my thought process a week ago. So the fact that it's changed, kudos to the Falcons. Something I talked about on another platform I'm on was sort of the whole process versus the results. And, for me, this whole process was whack, for lack of a better term, but, it resulted in sort of the right move in this thing all working out. So hopefully Matt Bryant comes back, continues to play like Matt Bryant. And, no one's talking about the kicking situation, a week or so from now. And so we can put the past this. But when you say it's genius, I'm like, okay, let's, it'll work out in the end. It's I guess it's the ends justify the means to a certain extent in a lot of people's eyes. And while I don't always agree with that philosophy, it's one of those things that ultimately no one's going to care too much as long as Matt Bryant is making kicks this year and no one's going to remember that he was not a Falcon for 6.5 months or whatever it worked out to be. So yeah, I'm glad he's back. I'm glad that this, dark chapter in Falcons history where they, didn't have the legendary Matt Bryant on their roster, even though he was out there, still being Matt Bryant, is finally closed, and hopefully we don't have to be as concerned about this in the future, as far as the kicking situation being a question mark for this team. So, yeah, that's what I'll say. I don't feel like fighting you on sort of semantic issues and whatnot. So let's get into the other roster moves that the Falcons made over the weekend. It was interesting that they did, I think for both of us, probably the biggest surprise was the retention of Ricky Ortiz when the Falcons made their final cuts. Obviously, when we say final cuts, it's not final because we came to find out on Monday that Ricky Ortiz was let go with an injury settlement, and the Falcons did sign Keith Smith, who was recently cut by the Oakland Raiders, a player that the Falcons tried to sign at the start of the 2018 offseason in free agency when he was with the Dallas Cowboys. And unfortunately, the Raiders wound up landing him, but then Smith lost the competition with Alec Ingold, who many considered to be the top fullback in this past year's draft class with the Raiders this past summer. So, final cuts, not so much. And so the biggest surprise is no longer with the team. So where did you sort of land on that particular move in the series of moves the Falcons have made at the fullback position since?
Yeah, it was interesting that Keith Smith, I guess, fell into their lap. We'll never know, but I'm curious what they would do had Keith Smith not been available. I mean, would they have continued to look further into the fullback market? I mean, the fullback position more than anyone, I think, on Twitter. So I don't know what other guys would be available to them. But yeah, like you said, the biggest surprise for me was the fact that there's 6 running backs, including that fullback on the roster. And one of the big, talking points, I think, of tonight's show, which we'll get into a little bit further, is how long do we expect the team to carry 6 fullbacks this season? But yeah, I mean, Keith Smith's obviously an upgrade. He was someone that the Falcons looked at, I guess, last year, right before they brought in Ricky Ortiz. So they're definitely upgrading that position and, showing that, they're very serious about this physical mantra and this, establishing the run and all of that they weren't able to necessarily do last season. A couple other notable points from the 53-man roster trimming, Alameda Zaccheaus making it, that was music to my ears. That was a guy that I think me and you both were pounding the table for all the way back since April. He definitely, in my opinion, it was clear that he was the best receiver option for that 6th spot. I was a little worried because it like you made the point on last week's show, it did appear like the coaching staff showed a preference to Christian Blake. Christian Blake was running with the starters the last 2 preseason games with Russell Gage being out. And so you thought he had a prime opportunity there to take that 6th spot. And, he didn't show enough, I don't think. And I guess the coaching staff saw that as well. And that's why Zaccheaus, who did continue to show stuff all the way through that final preseason game, made the cut. And I'm excited to see, I don't know how much we'll see of him in the 2019 season. I think he is, potential to be a game day inactive in most weeks. Maybe depending on how the return battle shakes out, maybe we see him again, at punt returner at some point this year. But I do think there's a possibility he's a game day inactive. And then the other point, Jaden Graham, I didn't think it was a surprise, when it happened this past Friday, but, had you asked me or told me that Jaden Graham would be the 3rd tight end on this roster heading into the season, I would have said you were crazy. But I mean, it was clear from the first preseason game at the Hall of Fame game all the way throughout. Jaden Graham just continued to make plays, continued to be a presence in the pass game. And then, he showed that he can handle it as a blocker. And that's probably most important from that 3rd spot. And because of the fact that he showed he could block, which is basically all that Logan Paulson can offer at this point in his career, I think that's what made the decision, somewhat easy for the coaching staff to put Jaden Graham's name there at that third spot. And, I couldn't be more happy for him. I had bumped into it. Interesting story. I had bumped into Jaden's family walking into the Hall of Fame game back in early August, and had a little chat with them for a couple minutes, and they're great people from Colorado. So, I couldn't be more happy for them as well to see their, son make it. And again, I think this is what this time of the year is probably what's most special, is that you do get some stories like this of long shots that continue to just work and work and work and find themselves on a 53-man roster. And hopefully, he can stick on it for the remainder of the year. I do think he's also a potential to be a game day inactive as well, just because of now Keith Smith's presence. I think, he can maybe double as a third tight end, by chance. So again, I don't know how much we'll see of Jaden Graham, but I think he definitely earned this opportunity. And if he is pressing the duties, I think we should be pretty comfortable with him playing in that role.
Yeah, no, I think with both those players, it's really about sort of future development. Obviously the Falcons decided to part ways with Eric Saubert, for whatever reasons that people want to come up with. I'm sure any of them sort of fit in that regard. And the hope is that maybe Jaden Graham can sort of lessen that void, I guess, or somewhat fill that void in the immediate future, and then potentially grow beyond it potentially down the road with his continued development, and potentially be a number 2 type of tight end, behind Austin Hooper for many years to come. I think that's ideally what the Falcons are hoping he can sort of grow into. And Zaccheaus, as you said, we both were high on his skills in terms of these, young wide receivers. It was one of those things where, like, throughout the offseason and OTAs and whatnot, you talked about this a number of times on the show about, the clones and whatnot, and all these young, talented wide receivers. And, as I am wont to do, always tend to be a little skeptical of offseason hype when it comes to players. But, watching Zaccheaus at Virginia, you definitely saw the talent jump off the screen. And while I agree with you, he is a player that's probably likely to be inactive for a large chunk of the season. But, I think he'll get a similar treatment potentially as sort of what Marvin Hall got a couple of years ago, where he wasn't active early in the season, but, slowly and surely worked his way, got a role on special teams as a gunner, got some opportunities on offense and whatnot. And so we might see Zaccheaus get involved there, as well as potentially be sort of a plan B or possibly a plan C as far as the punt return and kick return game goes, if Kenyon Barner doesn't necessarily live up to the production. We can talk about that later. But yeah, this is a guy that I do think has the potential, unlike a lot of young wide receivers that I think get a lot of hype from Falcon fans. Like, I think this is actually one that's legitimate in terms of his potential to be a regular part of the Falcons offense in the years to come. And so we'll have to sort of see where his development goes from here, over the next couple of seasons, assuming he's able to stick that long. But yeah, he's a talented young player that I'm eager to see sort of what he can develop into this season as well as the years beyond. So, you mentioned some of the guys, including a Christian Blake, that did wind up making it on the Falcons practice squad. They sort of signed a guy in Carson Meyer today to sort of get the 10th guy on their practice squad. For those of you guys that don't know off the top of your heads who the 10 players on the Falcons practice squad, several of them were not surprising, because I think, a couple of these guys we thought had an outside shot at making the roster. And when they didn't, it was like, okay, they're front runners to be practice squad guys. But you had Danny Etling, the quarterback. The Falcons picked up Brandon Powell, the wide receiver from Detroit. It's a similar player that you can maybe argue similar to guys like Zaccheaus and Marcus Green. Marcus Green wound up landing with the Philadelphia Eagles on their practice squad. I mentioned Blake. I mentioned Meyer. You had Sean Harlow, which was a little bit of a surprise to me. I thought a guy like Chandler Miller might make it over him just because of that ability to play center. We've heard about Sean Harlow's potential to play center, but we've yet to really see it in 3 summers with the team. You also had defensive tackles, Justin Zimmer, a guy that we talked quite a bit about in terms of his potential to possibly leapfrog Deidre Sanat and take a roster spot from Sanat. You also had Jacob Tuohy-Mariner, who I think flashed a lot as a pass rusher. Austin Larkin was another guy that I thought had a pretty good shot at making the back end of the roster. They picked up former Denver Bronco safety / linebacker Jamal Carter. Probably will be more of a strong safety here in Atlanta, but did dabble as a linebacker this past summer with the Broncos. And of course, free safety / nickel cornerback Chris Cooper as well. Matt, any thoughts on some of those practice squad pickups?
Yeah, I like this group, and I mean, you can correct me if you don't agree, but I think this is one of the stronger practice squad groups that we've seen in recent years under Dan Quinn. I think, you look at Justin Zimmer, a guy that we talked about throughout the summer as potentially being a guy that could have been on the 53-man roster. Austin Larkin's another one that we had thought maybe if they're going to carry, a fourth edge, since they seem somewhat light at edge right now. Glad to see that he's stuck. And then, Chris Cooper, another one who I thought. So those three guys right there, I thought were potentially like one of the last men that could have been on this 53-man roster. So hopefully, they can stay safe on the practice squad, because I think those are three potentially NFL caliber guys that if an injury strikes, we can see them in Atlanta at some point this season. I think some of the other guys are good developmental guys. I mean, Danny Etling, obviously, I thought was a no-brainer to be, it was no secret the team wants a third developmental quarterback. Given Danny Etling's athletic ability, mobile ability as a scout team quarterback, which we've talked about in previous week shows, he's going to play a major role on the scout team to mimic guys like Taysom Hill, to mimic guys like Kyler Murray. Christian Blake, obviously, him coming back potentially could get right back into that competition in 2020 to be, whether it's Mohamed Sanu's replacement or, he's that sixth receiver in 2020, since there could be a reshuffling in the wide receiver depth chart room. So, I'm glad for those guys to continue their development. I'm with you. Sean Harlow was a surprise. I thought Chandler Miller would get that nod, but we definitely did see some improvements from Sean Harlow towards the end of the preseason, especially with his ability to climb the second level in run blocking. So, maybe by him being on the practice squad, he finally gets that chance to develop at center. They can show him at center a little bit in practice and whatnot. So his time, I guess, is not done in Atlanta, which we thought earlier in the preseason it would be. So we'll see what's to come of that. But I do like this group. Again, I think it's one of the stronger groups that Dan Quinn has fielded on the 10-man practice squad. And that's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a supplemental roster with a couple guys that are close to being, guys that are cut out for the 53-man roster. I think we see that with guys like Justin Zimmer, Austin Larkin, even Jacob Tuiota-Mariner, like you said, flash some stuff as an interior pass rusher. So I wouldn't be shocked if any of those guys, any of that group of four, Chris Cooper being the fourth, see some time in Atlanta this year.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on that. Like, compared to last year, I thought the practice squad that they kept last year was
right. Yeah,
was bad.
Yeah.
And it included guys like Blake and Tuiota-Mariner and Jaden Graham, all guys that I think really showed a lot of improvement. And so that's what, when you hear the plan D, usually I kind of just roll my eyes, because over the years it's been like, yeah, they keep guys in the practice squad and then they cut them next year, just like pretty much every other team. The percentage of players that are on the 10-man practice squad and then wind up making the team the following year has been extremely low throughout the league, but even in the Dan Quinn era. And so it's like, oh, plan D, yeah, sure, yeah. Jaden Graham, yeah, sure. Jacob Tuiota-Mariner, okay, these guys didn't do anything. They just kept them because they needed bodies at those spots. And then you sort of see it actually work this summer, and those guys show significant growth. So the hope is that with this group, where I would argue comparatively to the group last year, a bunch of guys that I felt like legitimately, were good enough to make the practice squad, and some of these guys legitimately good enough to make the roster. One hopes that the same, if they show the similar amount of growth that, the same guys showed a year ago, then all of these guys are pretty much guaranteed to make the roster next year. If not the Falcons, then somebody else is elsewhere in the league. So, a stark change from a year ago, where I was just kind of looking at the practice squad like, all these guys are going to get cut. Next summer, it's like, whatever. They're just keeping bodies just to have bodies or whatever. But that proved not to be the case. So, one of the interesting things, and, one of my great disappointments of the weekend, and I knew it was not going to happen, but, the Falcons didn't make any trades. I look around the league and all these trades happen. I just let's get in on this trade season. I love NFL trades. They're the greatest thing in the history of the world. And we saw a massive amount of huge, maybe not franchise changing trades, but certainly franchise altering. I don't know. I'm being semantics with trying to get the word, but massive trades that we've seen the last couple of years with Laramie Tunsil and Jadeveon Clowney, among others. So Falcons didn't make any trades. I was hoping they would, but it is what it is. But one of the topics on that trade front is sort of the idea that looking at what Clowney wound up getting moved to Seattle and how little it was. And I think both of you and I sort of thought, oh, they're like, there's no chance they're going to trade for Clowney. But it's fun to think about, to have like a little thought exercise of what it would take to trade for Clowney. Then when you see the pennies that Seattle gave up to get him, you're like, come on, man. Like, what? Seriously? Like,
right.
We couldn't do that, But I'm curious to sort of get your thoughts on sort of the idea. Obviously it wasn't necessarily a likely outcome, but at least to play out the thought exercise, maybe get a couple of people upset that the Falcons didn't pull off that trade or whatever the case may be on that Clowney deal.
Well, the thing for me is the initial conversations you were hearing between, for Clowney was that, and again, he didn't want to go to Miami, but the original offer there was like Clowney for Tunsil. And when you hear stuff like that, it's like, all right, this is going to be a huge deal. And Clowney's not going to go for peanuts. Like whoever ends up getting him is going to have to give a pretty marquee player in return. And then you see that, Seattle's coming to the forefront on this, and like, who are they going to give? When I heard that they were offering a linebacker, I thought maybe KJ Wright was potentially the guy. And that's like a pretty substantial player to give up for a guy like Clowney. But when I saw that they gave up Barkevious Mingo and Jacob Martin, guys that are like the 5th and 6th linebacker on your team. And then one step further, you hear that Houston agreed to pay $7 million of a $15.9 million tag as a signing bonus. It's like, Atlanta, what turned you off? Like what? Because apparently, according to Justice Mosqueda, who I don't know who his sources were, but he had made the claim that Atlanta did call and went one step further and said Mohamed Sanu, was on the table for that. Like what potentially didn't work out there? Because we had seen already earlier in the offseason, there was reports from, I guess, Michael Lombardi that, Sanu was being dangled for a mid-round pick. So it didn't seem like they were ever scared to potentially offer Sanu. What, was it Beasley they didn't want to part with? Like, for me, I don't understand how they couldn't get in on this. Again, who knows how accurate the reports are, but Justice wasn't the only one tying Atlanta, to Clowney. So for me, I was bummed when I saw how little he fetched in return. I would have gladly, again, I love Sanu. I'm a huge Sanu fan. Me and you have gone back and forth where I've defended Sanu. So, people can't say that I don't like Sanu, but I would have definitely entertained the offer of Mohamed Sanu. And, again, if Houston's agreeing to pay $7 million, you don't necessarily have to put Beasley's contract in there. So they could still had kept Beasley. Now it would have been a little weird having, I guess Beasley on a $12.9 million contract being a backup to Clowney. But, if they could have gotten over that, I guess I could have as well. But, even if it wasn't Beasley, it could have been Sanu and Devondre Campbell if they wanted a linebacker, or it could have been Sanu and Foye Olakun. They could have developed a package, I think, to certainly match what Seattle did. I guess your only concern is, giving up that 3rd round pick when, picks are at a premium for Atlanta. They're only going to have, 6 next year. And if you got rid of a 3rd, they would only have 5. But, on the flip side, they likely wouldn't be able to retain Clowney, which again, I guess is a little bit of a drawback. But you're in a Super Bowl window, be aggressive, go all out for it. You're practically renting Vic Beasley anyways, is our understanding, based on how their contracts are and whether Beasley is going to be able to live up and return to his old 2016 form. So why not rent a better player in Jadeveon Clowney and give up a Vic Beasley? I would have been here for. It obviously didn't happen. But yeah, it was a little disappointing, waking up on Saturday, seeing how little Houston got in return for him. But thankfully, the Matt Bryant news kind of made up for that. But yeah, I was definitely bummed that the Falcons weren't more aggressive and potentially had beaten Seattle to the trade table there.
Yeah, my guess is, and this is pure speculation on my part, but this is just me trying to connect the dots and for once actually paint the Falcons in a quasi positive light. My guess is that when they made the call about Clowney earlier this summer, Houston's asking price was much, much higher. And by the time we got to Saturday, and Houston was sort of working on all these other trades that they got involved in over the weekend, that at a certain point they just were like, you know what, this offer that Seattle has is, the best offer, in trying to milk more from Miami, or he doesn't want to go to Miami, so that kind of nixes that trade. Or
so, do you think they call, like, how long ago do you think they called? I would have thought it was a more recent phone call. No.
I would say it wasn't this week. That's what I will say.
Okay.
Whether it was a week ago, I think, because Houston had sort of the leverage, they could have basically said like, oh, we're only giving him up for, because I think the early reports weren't they like, at least a second round pick or something like that with Connie, or a first round pick or something like that for him. And I just think as things got closer to the deadline, or at least the roster deadline, I think Houston just basically dumped him for whatever Seattle. They were like, we'll take whatever Seattle has because we're more focused on the Kenny Stills, Laramie Tunsil sort of deal. And this just sort of just greases the wheels, and they just dumped him for, peanuts. And I think by that point, the Falcons had been well out on that trade. And necessarily at the time when they were contacting the Texans, allegedly, their asking price was legitimately higher. And I think the Falcons also probably took it from the approach of, we're not going to probably re-sign Clowney. So why give up players that we like and think highly of, like Sanu, like Campbell, like Beasley, players that I'm sure at this point in time the Falcons believe, whether we agree with them or not, believe are going to play beyond 2019 with this roster, for a guy that's going to play basically 4 months and then be gone. So I think that's the way I would probably spin it, to give the Falcons a more favorable light. It's not one of those things where I think Houston was like, as they were negotiating with Seattle, they were then picking up the phone and calling the Falcons like, this is what Seattle's latest offer is, and calling Philadelphia, this is what Seattle's latest offer is. Can you beat that? I don't think it was that point. I think really all these other teams like Miami and Buffalo and Seattle, or Philadelphia, I'm sorry, sort of dropped off, and then basically Seattle was the only team that was negotiating in earnest by the time we got Saturday, and then basically Houston was like, whatever, we'll just dump them, and we'll take what we can get. And so I think that's probably what happens a lot of these times when trades, wind up being for peanuts. Like the whole Michael Bennett thing, him going for as little as he did, it was like the Falcons couldn't beat that. But I'm betting at the time when they were negotiating in earnest, the asking price was probably a little bit higher. And ultimately, things, I guess dip, the closer you get to some of these trade deadline stuff. So one of the topics we've teased, and we'll touch upon this before we get into our thoughts on these Week 1 opener against the Vikings, is sort of the idea that the Falcons carrying 6 running backs is more of a short-term sort of solution to whatever people deem the issue is. Matt, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, at first I would have said, yeah, I think it is a short-term thing, but now, given the signing of Keith Smith, I think fullback's not going away anytime soon. I really think the only spot potentially, that there'll be some influx on it is, Kenyon Barner's roster spot. And that all comes down to their turn game and what they do with that moving forward. Yesterday's practice, we saw Mohamed Sanu get some backup reps there, and Dan Quinn seems comfortable with Mohamed Sanu as a backup punt returner, which, again, I'm intrigued by that. I think, again, if Mohamed Sanu, might slowly be phased out of the offense a little bit, being that he's now the number 3 guy and Calvin Ridley is going to, take the mantle of the number 2 guy. This is still an opportunity. Mohamed Sanu is still a skillful player. He's still a playmaker, especially with the ball in his hands, with the yards after the catch ability. Putting him at punt returner does make some sense there. So, if they continue to get him more reps and he's comfortable with that, and, it sounds like that was something that he had done a little bit in his past. He doesn't have a lot of reps. Back in college, he had very little stats there, nothing to write home about. But again, I like him potentially in that role. So maybe we see at some point early this season where they make that switch to him, and then at that point, Kenyon Barner is no longer, he's an expendable commodity. Other than that, though, I think you're going to roll with the running backs as far as, Freeman at the top, Ito Smith backing him up. As long as they don't trade a guy like Bryant Hill, I think Bryant Hill is going to be a factor. And then, we'll see how often we see of Quadri Olison. I tend to think, he might, again, be one of those game day inactives for most weeks. Or maybe it's Hill. I don't know. I have a hard time believing all 4 of them see the field on game days, but, crazier things have happened. But yeah, I think it really comes down to whether it's an injury that forces one of those guys out. And again, I think it would be Kenyon Barner that would get forced out because, he only has really one role on this team, and that's the special teams aspect. Or, whether they're comfortable turning that return job off, sooner rather than later, then again, I think Kenyon Barner gets the short end of the stick and would be out. But other than that, again, with fullback being a featured element still with the signing of Keith Smith, which, again, I didn't see that coming really. This could be a longer-term experiment than we had first thought.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll sort of see how quickly Keith Smith gets up to speed on this offense. I'm not expecting him to play this week. Okay. I think he'll need more than 3 days of practice before the Falcons are going to throw him out there, particularly when you already have capable options like a Luke Stalker ready to go, a Jaden Graham ready to go. So I think you probably give him a week to sort of pick things up before you throw him to the Wolves. But we'll see. The Falcons have done crazier things. Danny Etling can speak to sort of the short turnaround in terms of playing, being signed versus being played. As for, them keeping 6 running backs, I'm with you. Basically, I think Barner is probably the guy that's the most vulnerable, and that's going to depend heavily on his production this season. When I saw the report that, Sanu was getting some reps alongside Barner and Justin Hardy fielding punts, I got a little excited. It was the first time in a long time that I actually got excited about some breaking Mohamed Sanu news. Then I saw his college stats, and I was like, oh, okay, wow. All right. Well, I was intrigued for a moment, and then I saw the college stats, and I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to get my hopes up too high. But, if I'm not going to complain if they give him that opportunity. I've long held the belief that having guys specifically to return kicks on your roster in this day and age is kind of a waste of a roster spot. And unless that guy is super productive, and we saw a guy like Farrell Cooper 2 years ago was in the Pro Bowl and has been cut twice since then. So it's one of those things where it's just not a position that has a lot of consistent production. There's only a handful of guys out there in the league that have been consistently productive these last couple of years. So it's one of those, it's just, to me, you're just better off just throwing anybody out there. And particularly when you look at Kenyon Barner's history in terms of his production, it's nothing to write home about. And then when you couple that with the idea that he's didn't technically earn the spot, he just kind of won it by default, or maybe you can at least phrase it that way. So I'll be curious to sort of see what he could do this season and if he winds up being pretty productive. Yeah, we'll just sort of have to see how that goes with the Falcons keeping all these running backs. A lot of it is just due to that they have a lot of talent at that position. And Allison's, shown ability as a special teams guy. That was kind of what we talked about him being drafted for, more so than necessarily being this, power back that, people talked so much about in the offseason. And you saw the emergence of Bryant Hill. Both you and I were two people that weren't as quick to write off Brian Hill as maybe everybody else was immediately after the Quadri pick, and we were vindicated by Hill's performance this summer, and of course Ito Smith. And again, as you say, the Falcons continue to want to have the fullback position. It was a little bit of a head scratcher when Ricky Ortiz was sort of penciled into that spot, but now that they've seemingly got an upgrade with Keith Smith, a guy that they presumably wanted to sign in 2018 before they wound up settling for Ricky Ortiz much later that offseason. Maybe if that had, different dominoes in an alternate universe where that move would have happened, we wouldn't be talking about the idea of phasing out their fullback position at this point in time. It would have just been an integral part, and would have made at least 2% of Falcon fans forget about the days of Patrick DeMarco. Certainly not me, but I'm sure others might with Keith Smith's performance. So looking forward to sort of seeing how this all plays out over the course of the season. But obviously, more pressing issues are coming up this Sunday as the Falcons kick off their 2019 regular season on the road against the Minnesota Vikings. It's interesting because the Falcons are going into this game with a lot of questions, and most of those are sort of centered on who's going to start on the offensive line. We know that the Falcons, like the Vikings, are going to have 3 new starters, but we just don't know who are those 3 new starters. The reports have been that James Carpenter has been taking first-team snaps at the left guard position after Jamon Brown's got the majority of those. The reports have been Matt Gono's been getting the first-team reps at right tackle after a summer of buying the Ty Sambrailo hype. Not me, but the rest of the world seemed to be buying that quite a bit. We've seen Caleb McGarry come back in that preseason finale, play well against the Jacksonville Jaguars. So I think a lot of people are excited about when he can get on the field sooner rather than later. Doesn't seem like it's going to be week 1. Falcons dropped their official depth chart, didn't have starters penciled in. It was just kind of like it could be Carpenter or Brown. It could be Gano or Sambrailo, which I think is just gamesmanship that, NFL teams do where they're like, we want them to spend the extra 6 minutes it's going to take this week to prepare for both of these guys. And so therefore that's going to completely, it's just dumb things that NFL teams do, but sometimes it makes sense. Other times it's just kind of like you're just doing this more for pettiness, I guess, just to play games with other teams. But I'm curious, Matt, what are your thoughts on whether or not this offensive line is going to shape together quickly going up against, again, we talked about this with Sam, one of the better defensive lines, or at least historically has been one of the better defensive lines in the league?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too concerned about the chemistry issues because, again, I don't know. Like, for me, I don't think McGarry is in legitimate contention right now just because of the conditioning. I think, missing an entire month, and, he was one of the top takeaways from the final preseason game. I thought he had a tremendous debut, but he even said as much after the game that, he was dragging after, 25 to 30 plays. So I still maintain that timeline of like week 3, week 4 is more accurate for when he could potentially, at the earliest, crack that starting rotation. Now, one of the points on the official depth chart, it actually had Gano or McGarry as the guy. So again, I don't know how much we can read into that when, we did hear in practice this week, it was Gano and Sambrailo taking the first team reps. But it does kind of seem, that it's a strong indication that it might be Gano at right tackle, which, again, I can't stress how crazy of a story that is for him, being an undrafted guy, being a red shirt last year, going through the Plan D. But he certainly earned it. If his number gets called, I mean, I think the fact that Dan Quinn said, that quote a couple weeks ago after the third or their dress rehearsal preseason game where it looked the way it should look from a right tackle. I think that was a telling statement. I think he's comfortable with him after seeing that performance, that, this moment, this competition is not too big. I mean, he went up against a defensive line that I think is very comparable to the defensive line he'd see in week 1 in Minnesota. The only difference now, it's a road atmosphere. He's got to deal with the crowd noise. So that's a little bit of a concern. But other than that, I'm comfortable with him if he's the guy. And then obviously the left guard spot, Brown or Carpenter. Carpenter's getting the first team reps. I'm not sure how much Brown mixed in there. I still think, Brown has a good chance of being the opening day starter. I'm wondering if they do any rotation. I doubt it, just based on the 46-man roster restrictions that there are. I think one of those guys would be inactive if the other guy's named the starter. But as far as a chemistry standpoint, I think a lot of them they've had a lot of reps together. There's been different rotations, different lineups, but I'm not really concerned about any of the chemistry issues. I'm just curious about who's going to be where, and obviously concerned about the front that they're going to face. I mean, Danielle Hunter is one of the best at his positions. Sam mentioned at the top of the show, Everson Griffin looks to be back to his old self, so that's somewhat scary. And that's going to be one of the major storylines of this game is how well the offensive line can protect Matt Ryan. Because if they can, I think there's opportunities on Minnesota's back end. I mean, there's lots of talk, and we didn't get into it with Sam, but there's talk about, Xavier Rhodes kind of, having a down year last year, and is he regressing as one of the top flight corners? Because, in the previous matchups with Julio Jones, Rhodes has won those matchups. So if he's regressed as a player, I think it's an opportunity for Julio Jones to have a big game. I think on the opposite side, Trey Waynes is a guy that's, he's a solid corner, but I would give the benefit of the doubt to a guy like Calvin Ridley. And then, one of their few injury concerns that the Vikings have, Mike Hughes, their first round pick from last year and their third cornerback, he's unlikely to play. He's dealing with an injury. So Mackenzie Alexander is the next man up. And I think, you'd have to give the benefit of the doubt to Mohamed Sanu in that matchup. So again, if they can protect Matt Ryan, there's opportunities to move this ball through the air on the Minnesota defense, in my opinion. So, I mean, again, it's one of the major talking points is how can they protect? But, again, if they can do that, it's a tall task. I think there's an opportunity to put up some points through the air.
Yeah. I think, to not jump the gun, but I think this is probably the most vulnerable the Vikings have been, for the Falcons to really, take them down, a team that they've sort of struggled against over the last couple of seasons when they faced them, just because of some of the issues you pointed out. But I am concerned about, that offensive line versus defensive line matchup as far as the Falcons are concerned, just because, I do wonder a little bit about the chemistry stuff, because we saw in that Jets game how much they struggled against. Well, they didn't really struggle against the blitz. I think.
And did they game plan for that? Because that's, I feel like people read way too much into that matchup with the Jets, and I think a lot of the struggles had to do with the Jets threw out stuff that you're not really game planning for.
No, that's fair. I want to take back that statement, but I would say that in the Alex Mack era, there have been more instances where they have been struggling against the blitz than I think probably a lot of people would assume, based off of Alex Mack's sort of, ability in sort of history in this league. And, one of the things I did notice looking up and when researching this matchup is how effective the Vikings were with their blitz. They don't blitz a lot. They were they were blitzed a below average amount from what I know last season, but I think they had like a ridiculous stat where they had like the third best defense in the league when they did blitz. And so it's one of those things that they're, Zimmer is really good at dialing up effective blitzes. And, if you have a team that at least over the last 3 seasons hasn't always dealt well with blitzes, you have a couple of new offensive linemen that maybe have only gotten a week or two of real solid reps working with the first unit. That's not necessarily, and then you couple that with an already talented front four, where, historically speaking, one of the issues the Falcons have had against the Vikings has been Jake Matthews struggles against a guy like Everson Griffin. Now, one of the things that happened last year was Jake Matthews made major gains, and many of the pass rushers that normally we would have said, oh, that's going to be a bad matchup for Jake, weren't bad matchups for him. So hopefully that continues, and Griffin continues to, decline or whatever, at least for a week. And we'll sort of see how some of these other matchups go. So I think it is a concern, but I think there's reason to be optimistic that really for the first time in the last 3 or 4 matchups against the Vikings, the Falcons offensive line will, hold its own and give this offense enough time, Matt Ryan enough time to to find some of these targets. As you mentioned, Xavier Rhodes has gotten the better of the Julio Jones matchup. With the Vikings have done an excellent job of keeping Julio contained in that game. But if Rhodes is taking a step back, that's an opportunity for Julio to make some more plays. Trey Waynes was a player that I was very high on when he was at Michigan State, but I really haven't been at all impressed by him as a pro. And one of the disappointing things I thought we didn't see in 2017 was the Falcons really go after him with Taylor Gabriel in that Minnesota Vikings game then. And I'm hoping we get to see them really attack him with Calvin Ridley this week. And I think if they can, in addition to running football, as well as playing some good defense, which I think is sort of the next topic that is sort of stands out in terms of these matchups. And like this Vikings offensive line, we've been talking about the improvement that this defensive line has made with the additions, the hope that, you can get more out of Tack and Vic as well as some other players this year. This Vikings offensive line is ripe for the picking. With the question marks that we talked about earlier in this episode, talking about Elflein and Garrett Bradbury, who haven't necessarily hit the ground running at their respective positions. That's where Grady Jarrett's going to be lining up quite a bit, and Jack Crawford and whatnot. Then you have, Riley Reef, who was a player that the Vikings initially wanted to move to a new position and not have him at left tackle, but because they didn't necessarily make the upgrade in the offseason, they were stuck sort of playing him at left tackle. And then you have Brian O'Neill. And, if Vic Beasley is going to have a breakout game going up against an offensive tackle, a young offensive tackle that's never seen him before, that's an opportunity for him. So I think the matchups do favor the Falcons in the defensive line so that it is a potential topic of conversation where a week from, today, we're going to be talking quite a bit about this pass rush coming alive and, maybe give the people a little bit of false confidence before they face the Eagles. But that's a conversation we'll talk about a week from now. But I think this is a matchup that the Falcons, historically have really struggled in the trenches against the Vikings. And I think this week, for the first time in a while, we could see those struggles come to an end. I think this is the perfect opportunity on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, I mean, I almost wonder, had the Vikings taken a guy like Andre Dillard over Garrett Bradbury and shifted Riley Reef, inside the left guard, is this a better unit? Is this a less favorable matchup? Because, for me, the matchup, like you said, I'm looking at is Tack McKinley versus Riley Reef, who, back in 2017 when Tack was a rookie, got the better of Reef for a sack. And I think Tack could be in store for another big game because, I'm with you. I don't think the Vikings are very comfortable with Reef there, but, that's the hand they've been dealt. So again, I think that matchup, certainly is in Atlanta's favor coming into week one. Again, with Garrett Bradbury being a rookie center, Pat Elflein, probably being one of the weaker links, if not the weakest link on this offensive line. I think Grady Jarrett could be in line for a huge game. So, I think, at the point that you made with them being probably the most vulnerable that they've been as a team, I wouldn't disagree with that. Sticking on the defensive side of the ball, again, if the Vikings offensive line does protect well for Kirk Cousins, I think the matchup that could decide the game, from the Falcons defensive standpoint is, KZ and Isaiah Oliver going up against Thielen and Diggs. Thielen and Diggs get moved around quite a bit to find the favorable matchup. So I think it's going to be tough to just say, hey, yeah, Trufant's going to be on Thielen. KZ's going to be on Diggs. Oliver maybe gets on, Josh Doxson, who just signed with the Vikings this week. And again, it remains to be seen how much run he really gets being with his first week with the team. But whoever Isaiah Oliver's on and whoever Demonte Casey's on, that's certainly a matchup to watch. Because again, we had talked, previously in the summer based on how we see Isaiah Oliver this year. And again, we're talking about two of the best receivers in the league in Diggs and Thielen. Isaiah Oliver is now pressed into duty. He's the guy now opposite Trufant. Are these the types of matchups he's going to thrive in? We're going to find out early on because, again, the shiftier guys like Thielen and Diggs are, is that in Isaiah Oliver's wheelhouse? He's probably, more comfortable at least dealing with the bigger guys, dealing with the Josh Doxson rather than a Thielen and Diggs. But again, it's a great opportunity for him to show what he's got now, being the guy. And again, that's going to be a matchup I had my eye on and could very well determine the game, because if Thielen and Diggs are eating him up, then it could be a long day.
Yeah, I think I said it on an episode maybe 2-3 weeks ago that you can make a case that this Stephon Diggs matchup against Isaiah Oliver will be his toughest matchup of the season, just looking at a pure skill set standpoint, with Diggs, being one of the quicker, one of the better route runners in the league. And that's not necessarily what Oliver was really brought in to be. He was brought in to, go to toe with the statues, the Mike Evanses and the Michael Thomases.
Yeah.
And, based off of his brief action, has struggled a little bit against those quicker, more explosive guys, just because he doesn't necessarily have that great makeup speed and that explosiveness. He's a great athlete, but it's not necessarily like he's a guy that, is going to be able to turn and run with guys like Diggs and keep pace with those. And you mentioned Thielen. He's a guy that spends just as much time in the slot as on the outside, and that's probably why you're not going to see the Falcons try to shadow him with Desmond Trufant. And so that's going to mean plenty of opportunities for a guy like Casey to go up against Adam Thielen, who again has been one of the more consistently productive wide receivers in the league. And we hope that we're, by the end of the season, we're talking about the Falcons having arguably the best wide receiver duo in the league with guys like Julio and Calvin Ridley. But right now, you would probably say the championship belt is in Minnesota with these two guys. And so that can cause a lot of problems. The Vikings want to run the football as well. And we know the Falcons have had a history of not being able to stop the run. Hopefully, with the potential struggles that the Vikings have on the offensive line and the improvements the Falcons have made on their defensive line with players like Tyler Davison and Alan Bailey, we can sort of nip that in the bud, and Deion Jones coming back at full strength. Hopefully that will sort of solve those issues along with Keanu Neal. But it is one of those things that if we can't cover these wide receivers and the Vikings are able to run the football, while that's not necessarily a scary Vikings offense that's going to drop a 40 burger on the Falcons defense, if this offense can't do better than what it has done in the past against the Vikings, it's going to be a low scoring game. And that's, exactly what the Vikings want. The Vikings want to win this game 20-17. They don't want to get this game into the 20s where, they have to score 24, 27, 28, 30 plus points to beat this Falcon team, because they just know that they're at a disadvantage in that regard. So, even if, Diggs and Thielen aren't running circles around the Falcons DBs in a 20-17 game, all you need is a couple of big plays, a couple of, 138-yard pass to Stephon Diggs to set up a score that can be sort of the difference between winning and losing a game. So I think you're right. I think this is going to be one of the more interesting matchups, and I think how Isaiah Oliver handles this Diggs matchup in particular, I think will be a good litmus test for potentially what he could do the rest of the season, and whether we should have really high expectations or more tempered expectations in regards to what he could do in the first year as a starter.
Do you think we see press coverage from Isaiah Oliver in this matchup? Because I know, again, that was a sticking point on the defense, being more aggressive, getting up in the opponent's face. But, you almost think it's not a great idea, given that, again, the shiftiness of Thielen and Diggs, playing a little bit more off coverage so that Isaiah Oliver has more time to read and react. I mean, what do you think they end up doing? Do they stay with the aggressive mantra, or do they dial it back just for this matchup, just to, make things a little bit easier on Isaiah Oliver?
I think if their goal is to play man, I don't know if we'll see a lot of press. I think if their goal is to play some cover three and play a little bit more bump and run, I think it makes a lot more sense. Let's try to see if you can throw off the timing of the offense before those guys bail. And again, that was sort of the hallmark of the Seahawks over the years with guys like Sherman and Brandon Browner. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's the plan against this Vikings wide receiver core. Just because I don't necessarily know, if I'm the Falcons coaching staff, I haven't seen enough from Isaiah Oliver to fully trust him to go man to man against either of these wide receivers. And so that's something I would probably feel out and see how he handles it early in the game before really dialing up the man coverage outside of, the 3rd and 7s and 3rd and 9s or whatever the case may be. So yeah, I think we will see a healthy amount, probably more than we saw last year. But I don't necessarily know if we're going to, see press all game long. So I think the Falcons will try to mix up their coverages to a certain extent. So, Matt and I are, these roster nerds, and we like to talk about hashtag inactive analysis. So, Matt wants to give his takes because he always wants to have something to one up me on and be like, I got this right, and Aaron, you're an idiot for getting this wrong, or whatever the case may be. But one of the interesting things with the Falcons roster and some of the decisions that they've made is going to be sort of which players are sort of on their 46-man game roster. And sort of, Matt, you have your thoughts on the 7 guys that will likely be inactive this Sunday against the Vikings. I have my thoughts, and this is by no means an indicator that this is going to be the 7 guys for the entire season, but it is at least for this 1 week. So, place your bets, Matt, I guess, in terms of.
I will say here, I got to give you some credit. I overlooked the fact that, hey, Keith Smith, first week on the team, probably is going to need a week or two. So I did not have him on my original list, but now looking at it and thinking about it, I think he probably should be. But the list I did have, I have Quadri Allison as the running back that would be inactive. I talked about earlier, I think Zacchaeus is likely an inactive. The spot I should have Keith Smith, I had Jaden Graham. I thought, again, Jaden Graham being on the roster, he could be used as a fullback, but now that Keith Smith's there and Keith Smith's a special teams presence, Graham doesn't necessarily need to be activated, but I think he will be now in week 1. So I'd probably want to put Keith Smith's there. I think McGarry, again, working his way back conditioning wise, I think he's going to be inactive the first week or two. I have Carpenter. I do think Brown still, until I see otherwise. Now, again, we talked about it. Reports are Carpenter is working with the ones earlier this week. We'll see if that continues throughout. But for the time being, I have Carpenter. I have Sanat, and mainly because of the special teams aspects of John Kaminsky. I think Sanat's more ready to contribute on defense, but because he plays the nose tackle and it's a position that's likely going to get 30% of the snaps, I think Davison can handle all 30% of those. So there's not a huge need for him to be activated, given that he's not a big special teams force. So I have him. And then, lastly, I have Kendall Sheffield, mainly because of the hamstring injury, but it did seem like on Monday he was, working out, stretching and stuff. So he might be good. And if that's the case, then given his speed on special teams, there's a good chance that he plays. But if they want to give him another week, I think, to recover, I think, they'll be in good hands with Bloody Ray Wilson and Jordan Miller. But I know you think otherwise, so I'll let you go through your 7 guys.
Well, the correct 7 guys is Keith Smith, Zacchaeus, Caleb McGarry. Again, it seems like they're going to go with Carpenter week 1, but we'll sort of see if that's the Falcons doing Falcon things or whatever the case may be. So I have Jamon Brown being inactive for this week 1 game, which I think is personally disappointing to both you and I, if that is the case. But we'll just sort of have to see how that situation gets resolved itself. There's certainly no guarantee that whoever starts week 1 at left guard will finish the season starting at left guard. So I also have Deidre Sanat as well for the same reasons that you sort of said. And I do have Bleedy Ray Wilson and Jordan Miller inactive for this game, largely due to the expectation that I do think Kendall Sheffield will be back healthy and ready to sort of fulfill their special team spot. So the main difference we have is basically I have, I guess, Jordan Miller instead of you having Quadri Olison and Sheffield instead of I have Bleedy Ray instead of Sheffield. So those will be the sort of telling things. So let's get into our mailbag questions. And as a reminder, for anybody who's just recently joined us in the last several minutes, one of the new features that we are doing is that if you ask a question in the YouTube chat, after we get through these main mailbag questions, we can do some quick hitters to sort of close out the show. And so if you have any questions or you've asked some questions in the chat, keep them coming and we might be able to get to your topic in a few. But our first mailbag question comes from Fan Since 1988. He asks, would the Falcons be bold enough to rotate Gano and Caleb to start the year?
I'm assuming this means like an in-game situation where they would rotate them.
That's what I assumed as well.
Yeah. I don't necessarily think that's a good idea. Again, we had talked a little bit about the chemistry, and I think that's where you can, upset the chemistry issues on the offensive line if you're dealing with something like that, where, one series you go with Gano, and the next series you go with McGarry. I think, really you got to stick with one guy throughout a game, and ride him out, and then on a week by week basis, evaluate whether that guy did enough to lock down that position. But yeah, I think it's a dangerous game to do that and kind of rotate those guys in throughout the game.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think typically, historically speaking, when the Falcons have done that, and they did it during Ryan Schrader's rookie season, they did it. I don't know if it was I think it was 2013. With Peter Kahns and Harlan Gunn at the right guard spot. So they did it a bunch, I guess, in that 2013 season. Typically, that happens in the second half of the season when you're trying to get some rookie like a Schrader up to speed. And so I don't necessarily expect the Falcons to rotate Caleb McGarry in anytime soon. Maybe if, for whatever reason, Matt Gano plays well this first month and then starts to struggle a little bit, then maybe in the second half of the season, the Falcons might start, easing Caleb McGarry into the lineup. But more than likely, I think the Falcons will probably go fully all in on whoever the starter is, again, assuming it's Matt Gano at this point, week one, then assess after the first week whether or not they need to make a change. If Gano performs well, then they won't. If Gano struggles, which is also a possibility, despite our high hopes on Matt Gano, because he is facing a guy that had almost 15 sacks last year, who's very good, very long, very athletic, very explosive. So could give him problems. We saw Montez Sweat beat him in that Redskins game. And Dino Hunter, in my opinion, is a better version of Montez Sweat at this point. So, then I think the Falcons would sort of entertain the possibility of making a switch for the week 2 game. But then again, it's not going to be any easier because you're going to face guys like Brandon Graham and others. So it's one of those things where I don't necessarily see the Falcons rotating guys, particularly early in the season. But if we get to a situation, I won't sit here and say that that's an impossibility later in the season, depending on how circumstances go. But right now, my guess is it'll be Gano, and then when the Falcons decide to move on from Gano, it'll be McGarry, and then that'll be sort of the final thing, and they'll just roll with McGarry even if he struggles until the end of the season because he's their first-round pick. Mantis Toboggan MD, aka Sebastian's dad, 19 on Twitter, asks, how good is the Vikings running back depth? What type of offensive scheme are the Vikings running? And what key matchup will determine this game's outcome?
Well, I mean, to talk about their running back depth, I wouldn't say their depth is great. I mean, at the top, I think Dalvin Cook is potentially one of the better running backs in football. And his biggest issue is health, and it sounds like he's healthy. And if he is, this scheme now that they've transitioned to the wide zone that Gary Kubiak has brought over, that we all wish he was running in Atlanta. It's a match made in heaven for him. I think it's a great fit, given his explosiveness, his one cut and go ability. So yeah, I mean, it's a very similar offense to what we see in Atlanta. They're gonna run a lot of play action off of that. So if they can establish that run game and get some big plays, moving off that wide zone, they're going to then spring the other way on the play action and could potentially hit us with some deep crosses and stuff to guys like Thielen and Diggs. So, that's the worry and concern. You would hope, because of the fact that it is a variation of our offense, we should be well equipped and prepared to guard against it. But I mean, it's been an offense that's been used for decades now, and has continued to have great success throughout the NFL, despite the loads of film to study off of it. So again, it's going to be a challenge. As far as the key matchups go, I mean, we talked about them a little bit earlier. I think the offensive line in general, the Falcons going up against the defensive line, but I guess particularly that right tackle spot, whoever it is going up against Danielle Hunter, could determine the outcome of the game. I think the one point that I want to make, though, is it does seem like Dirk Cutter is more keen on providing help to that side of the line, and that's something that I was disappointed with Steve Sarkisian. we saw last year that he would just leave Ryan Schrader on an island, despite the fact that, he was a turnstile at times. I don't think we have that worry or concern with Cutter. I mean, I think we've already seen it in the preseason, providing tight end chips or sliding the protection over that way. So that is somewhat reassuring that, I'm expecting a lot of that in this matchup, because Hunter is a guy that you got to know and account for. As far as, the Falcons defense, I think, Tack McKinley versus Riley Reif's a big one. Grady Jarrett versus, Pat Elflein, Garrett Bradbury's another one. And then, Isaiah Oliver and DeMonte Casey versus Thielen and Diggs is the third one I would watch and could determine the game.
Oh yeah, hitting up these questions. I think the Vikings running back depth is pretty solid. I mean, I know Alexander Madison had a pretty good preseason. Their third running back is Amir Abdullah. He was a starter like 2 years ago. So it's not as if they're bad there. So I don't think their depth is a major concern. Obviously, Cook is sort of the lead guy. It's a very similar dynamic to the Falcons here. Many people thought Dalvin Cook was a more explosive version of Devontae Freeman when he came out a couple of years ago, and has dealt with injuries last couple of years to a much greater degree than Freeman has. So we'll sort of see if Cook can sustain any potential success that he had. But, you look at the last 8 games last season, he was very productive. He was, putting up numbers both as a runner and in the passing game. So certainly a talented guy, and certainly I will be rooting for him because I just drafted him in the fantasy draft last night. So certainly I want him to do well. Maybe he can take a week off this week. But Sam talked about the offensive scheme in terms of Kevin Stefanski's roots. He sort of joined Minnesota back in the Brad Childress days. It's those West Coast roots. Kubiak is a West Coast guy. Matt said it. It's that outside zone, play action heavy scheme that Kirk Cousins ran in the Shanahan days in Washington. And so it seemed, again, Cook, Freeman, it meshes really well with what the Vikings want to do offensively, which is run the football, dial up some shot plays to guys like Diggs and Thielen, and then, work the tight ends over the middle of the field with guys like Irv Smith and Kyle Rudolph, and basically be a similar offense to what the Falcons have been in the Dan Quinn era, but obviously, without a Julio Jones, but 2 really good non-Julio Jones caliber wide receivers. And just to sort of reiterate the key matchups, I think again it's the trenches. Whether I'm going to sit here and say the Falcons offensive line versus the Vikings defensive line is more important than the Falcons defensive line versus the Vikings offensive line, I do think it's going to boil down to which team can do a better job controlling the line of scrimmage. And again, going back the last couple of matchups, that has overwhelmingly been the Vikings and been sort of their key to success, with Adrian Peterson in those days just running roughshod over Paul Warlow and Jerick McKinnon doing the same thing back in those days. And that's continued in recent years as well. So I really do think if the Falcons going up against this sort of outside zone scheme, one of the things that the outside zone has the most problems with is penetration. And that's been, that was one of the reasons why the Falcons were so ineffective at running the football last year. And so we need guys like Jared and Davison and Tack and Beasley and et cetera to really sort of disrupt this offensive line and get in the backfield and really stop the Vikings offense cold. And if they can't run the football, then that means that forces them to throw the football, which then allows our guys to pin their ears back and get after the quarterback. And the same thing applies for the Falcons offense, the opposite, meaning if they can run the football effectively, if they don't necessarily get into some situations where the Vikings players are able to pin their ears back, and as Matt said, they can use some 6 and 7 man protections to chip and help out these guys and run the football and get an early lead and whatnot, all these various factors. So I think it starts up front. It sounds cliche, but I think, historically speaking, particularly these first 2 games for the Falcons, it's going to be a lot on their offensive and defensive line to help them win these games. Justin Sandus asks, why do you think it's taken so long for Julio's deal to get done, and will it be completed by Sunday?
To answer this one, I'm kind of just going to steal Arthur Blank's answer that he's kind of echoed a couple times. Basically, I mean, it's a big money deal. We're talking about Julio being the highest paid receiver, which puts him at $20 million a year annual clip. And with it being the third contract, Julio's now on the other side of 30. Both parties want to do the right thing by themselves. And, again, you got to look at the guarantees. How much are we guaranteeing in this deal? Because do you really want to guarantee a 34-year-old Julio Jones, that full year? And I'm sure his side's probably pushing for it. So again, I just think it's a delicate situation, like Arthur Blank has kind of described it as. And it's just two sides negotiating, and sometimes there's a lot of back and forth. And I think that's what's going on here. I'm still not concerned to answer the second part. I do think it gets done. Arthur Blank even said as much this week. He'd be very surprised if it didn't get done. And I think, Jeff Schultz had a follow-up tweet when he made his initial report and basically said, Julio's meeting with the media on Thursday. So, he probably wants to get this done before that so he doesn't have to answer any more questions because, at this point it's become frustrating, I think, for all sides. Dan Quinn seems like he's frustrated to continue to answer questions on it. So, I wouldn't be shocked if we see something tomorrow morning or Thursday morning, but I do think by Sunday, Saturday at the very latest, I think there will be a contract for Julio Jones.
Yeah, I joked a couple of weeks ago that, it'll happen the Saturday before week one, and just sort of not really being serious about it. Just like, knowing the Falcons, they'll wait till the day before the season starts so they can announce it or whatever the case may be. And at that time, I thought it would have gotten done. So I'm going to still, I guess, if that's the case, then I'll be like, yes, I told you guys it'll get done.
Yeah, and you're going to keep pounding that profit angle, aren't you, too? Falcons profit, Aaron Freeman. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I'm with you, Matt. I think, I don't know why it hasn't gotten done. It seemed like it was imminent, 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly what the hang-up is in terms of getting this deal finalized, because it seemed at least pretty straightforward to me, sort of where, guarantee a whole bunch of money over the next 3 years, throw in some, back end money that pushes the total max value to 19, 20 million a year. Bing, bang, boom, you're done. But obviously, that is an oversimplification, but it seemed like it wasn't necessarily a big hurdle to go through. But, I've been hearing a lot of people talk about is Julio going to show up week one? I don't know where that came from. Maybe Matt, but Julio Jones not playing on Sunday, that would be that would be the biggest shock I've ever seen. That would be on the level of Andrew Luck retiring, of just what the heck is happening? This is the biggest. So
yeah,
I don't.
It would go against everything that he's kind of basically said and stands for. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so that would be neck and neck with Andrew Luck's retirement as the biggest mind-blowing shock of the calendar year of 2019 as far as football is concerned. So I'm not worried about that, but it is notable that this has been something that's been in the works for 13 plus or probably 15 months or something like this at this point.
Yeah,
and it hasn't gotten done, which was, I'll be interested to see what the final parameters of this deal are, just because it would just be weird to me that it's this is a pretty straightforward contract. Why did this take 15 months to negotiate?
Do you think, because one of the things I was thinking is, and I don't know, I forget who said it, but there was a report that 22 to 23 million. Do you think this could be like an Aaron Donald, real market, outlier type of contract where, because the $20 million number has been thrown around the most, it's been the most common number, but, Julio Jones is in a different stratosphere. I think we can all agree that as far as a wide receiver. I mean, he's in the Aaron Donald stratosphere of wide receivers, in my opinion. Do you think that's what's holding up? This could be a huge, huge number that we maybe weren't really expecting?
I mean, it's possible. I mean, at this point in time, anything's possible.
Yeah.
As far as numbers go, we've talked about that before with other contracts, with the Deion Jones, with the Grady Jarrett, even with going back to Matt Ryan's deal, where we kind of threw numbers out to be it could be this high, and it never got to that level. So it would be interesting if this is the contract that is sort of significantly more than the quote unquote market value, which is seemingly $20 million at this point in time. So that would be very interesting to me that this is the contract that the Falcons were, again, no judgment in the statement at all, but just it would be interesting to me that this would be the contract that the Falcons decided, you know what, let's go all in. And
why do you say that though? I mean, again, we're talking about Julio Jones here.
Just because Julio's at an older age, and if you were going to push the market forward, you would assume that they would have done it with Matt Ryan. For them to get, arguably under market contracts with Grady Jarrett and Deion Jones as easily as they did, you would have just, like, not to say that you're going to get an under market contract for Julio Jones, just like to pay him, $80 million over 4 years with, $60 million guaranteed or whatever that number is, and boom, But if it's like, $110 million over 5 years or whatever, like that would just surprise me. That's all.
Okay.
So we got a couple of quick hitters. First one comes from Davon Wilson. He asked, "Do you think Jermaine Grace Sheffield get any opportunity to play a good amount of time on Sunday?"
I think with Jermaine Grace, he's there to be the backup nickel linebacker, I think. And, it's interesting. I don't know. I mean, because if he were to see time, it would be, subbing out, I guess, Devondre Campbell, because you're not taking Deion Jones off the field. So if there is an opportunity, that's where it be. And maybe that does happen because, I did speculate on Twitter, once the 53-man roster came out and the fact that they didn't keep an extra edge, I think we are going to see Devondre Campbell some more, on the edges this year. And if that's the case, then, you're going to need someone, alongside Deion Jones, at the linebacker spot in nickel and whatnot. So maybe that is Grace. I would have thought Olakun would have the first opportunity. I mean, based on the preseason usage, that's what you would be led to believe. But, I really think Jermaine Grace is there as a safety blanket for Deion. And then, obviously on special teams, he's going to be a big factor and force there. With Kendall Sheffield, unless an injury hits, I don't think we're going to see him. I think we're more inclined to see a third safety if they're going to run dime coverages rather than a corner. Maybe I'm proven wrong on that. But I really think, again, like Grace, you're going to see Sheffield on special teams using that speed from the gunner spot and, in the different coverage aspects of special teams. But I don't necessarily think there's a lot of actual reps to go around for those guys, provided there's no injuries on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, I expect Grace and Sheffield to play special teams. I'm not expecting really much of them on defense. You mentioned sort of Campbell playing some edge. The thing I noticed in the preseason is that primarily when that happened, it was when the Falcons were in nickel and they played like a 3-3-5 nickel, and they had Campbell on the edge and either Beasley or Tack as the other edge, and then went with a standard 3-man front with Jarrett and Tyler Davidson. And Tyler Davidson didn't play a ton of nickel snaps, but when he did, that's what the Falcons did, and had him line up at the nose tackle. And I think, either Jack Crawford or Alan Bailey played. So it's one of those things where we'll sort of have to see if that's continues to be the case into the regular season, or if that's just something the Falcons were tinkering with. But I think what we'll probably see with Campbell getting some of those edge snaps is more of maybe you can argue, a little bit more of a run-oriented nickel front, just to have, those interior guys a little bit tighter to the interior and more resemble those bear fronts that we've talked about in this offseason. So, for me, like I think, Jermaine Grace would get an opportunity in the nickel, but I think Foye Olakun is probably going to be ahead of him. I think, again, based largely off of what we saw in the preseason with sort of where Grace was sort of buried as like the third string middle linebacker behind guys like Carter. And then again, when Olakun came back in the preseason, he was getting those middle linebacker reps. So I don't necessarily think we'll see much of Grace early in the season on defense unless there are injuries. The same thing goes with Sheffield. I'm with you. If the Falcons do decide to go 6 DBs, I think you're more likely to see Kamal Ishmael jump in as a sixth defensive back, but really just a box linebacker or whatever the case may be in that regard to sort of beef up, potentially a 3-3-5 or whatever the case may be at that spot. So I don't think we'll see those guys early in the season on defense unless there are injuries. But as the year progresses, we might get to see a little bit more of them. Okay, we had another one. Okay, we got one from Make You Fumble. Why the hell are we carrying 5 running backs?
It's a great question. We talked about it a little bit earlier. That was my biggest surprise. Well, again, maybe let me take a step back because originally I did think the 5 running backs were going to happen. I didn't think the 6 with the fullback was going to happen. Simply put, the 5 running backs are a thing because, no one stepped up to win the return job. And, as Aaron pointed out, Kenyon Barner simply won it by default, being the veteran presence there. That's what he was brought in for. Was an insurance policy and nothing more at returner. And, Falcons had to cash in on that insurance policy because, Marcus Green fumbled away his opportunity. Zacchaeus didn't really win it over. He might still be a factor there later in the season, but as of right now, Dan Quinn said it. Kenyon Barner is going to lead the way at returner. We'll see how long that lasts. It could be a longer term experiment than we initially thought, but we could also see someone like Sanu take the return job away from the punt return aspect, have Ito Smith be the kick returner, and then they could phase out Barner and bring on an extra D lineman or something like that. But it's simply a special teams thing. So really look at it like 4 running backs and, a 4th specialist on the roster.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people sort of interpret it as like, oh, this is the Falcons committing to the run. I don't necessarily interpret that way. Like, we know the Falcons want to run the ball more this year than they did last year when they were like 32nd in the league in terms of, how often they ran the ball. So they want to get back to being more balanced. That goes without saying. But I don't necessarily know if this means like as big a commitment to the run as maybe some people are interpreting it as. I think ultimately it boils down to, as Matt said, Barner winning the return job. That the Falcons wanted that to be a wide receiver like a Marcus Green, and he didn't win it. So that leads to him. I think, the Falcons weren't necessarily sold on Brian Hill going into the summer, being, sticking and making this roster. As I mentioned earlier, I think both Matt and I, were optimistic that Brian Hill would, be able to would play well enough to potentially earn a roster spot. But it was just a question of whether or not it would be enough in the coaching staff's eyes to retain him, given potential other issues there. And we saw that. So that's why he made the team. So I think those are really the 2 factors of why the Falcons kept 5 running backs. And then, they continued to want a fullback involved in the offense, which I guess is a little bit of a head scratcher given some of the offseason moves and the hiring of Dirk Cutter. And sort of we saw Stocker and Graham fill those shoes. But, I guess the Falcons saw a guy like Keith Smith available and said, you know what, like, this is the guy who we wanted all along over Ricky Ortiz. So we're not going to pass up this opportunity to get sort of the guy that we originally wanted. So I think that's sort of the explanation of why the Falcons have so many running backs, not necessarily because they're going to be super committed to running the football. Or like, they're going to run the ball more just by default because they hopefully can't run the ball less than they did last year. But it is one of those things where I don't necessarily think people should think of this offense as being, a run-first team or anything like that just because they have all these running backs. I just think circumstances led to at least 2 of these guys, or really 3 of these guys, to be added to the roster when probably, 2-3 months ago, they could have carried just as little as 3 running backs and we wouldn't have batted an eye. And it's just guys stepped up and other guys didn't. That's the bottom line. Matt Tate asks, who has the most talented team out of these 2?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, I was thinking about kind of, I had done in years past on Twitter, just breaking down position by position, who has the edge. And I was kind of doing that a little bit, brainstorming that earlier in the week. And, going through it, I'd say on paper, the Falcons, and again, this isn't, I don't believe it to be homerism anyways. I think the Falcons have, more positions in favor or an edge than the Vikings. I mean, you look at quarterback, I think, you give Matt Ryan the edge, give the Falcons the edge there at running backs. While Aaron pointed out, it's not a weak group by any means in Minnesota, with a couple of the guys like Amir Abdullah being a former starter in Detroit. I'd still lean towards the Falcons just because, again, I think they have 4 guys that could potentially be lead backs, in the NFL, with the addition of Quadri and the emergence of Hill, and then obviously year 2 of Ito Smith. The tight ends, I'd probably give Minnesota the edge there. That's probably the only spot on offense where I'd give them the edge. I think narrowly receiver, I'd give the edge to the Falcons, and then offensive line, while it's 2 groups that have struggled and kind of been completely revamped, I do think the presence of Alex Mack and Jake Matthews gives the Falcons the edge there. So, offense, they're kind of an overwhelming favorite. Defensively, it's where, things get a bit dicey for the Falcons. Obviously defensive line, you got to go Minnesota. Linebacker group, Minnesota, although, I could be convinced either way, I think, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on the linebackers. DBs, again, it's almost a draw, but, I think, that's tough. I think Atlanta, maybe go Minnesota just because they have a little bit more of proven a presence there. And safety, I don't know. I think because of Ricardo Allen, and again, you'll have to remind me who the free safety is now in Minnesota, but
Anthony Harris.
I mean, he's a solid, underrated player. And again, I mean, that could go either way, but I think Ricardo Allen, just being, in the league a little bit longer, being a starter a little bit longer, I'd give the Falcons the edge at safety with Keanu Neal and Harrison Smith, almost being a draw. But I think Atlanta, it's a very long-winded answer, and to sum it up, I think Atlanta does have the better roster on paper. And again, that kind of goes to what we were talking about earlier with, this is probably the most vulnerable this Minnesota Vikings team has been, in the previous matchups. Which is why I think it's a great opportunity to beat them this year. And I certainly think it's important to get off to a fast start on the season, given that the Eagles are waiting for them in week 2. But yeah, I'd say the Falcons on paper are the more talented team. But again, you don't win games on paper, and going into their building, it's going to be a tough matchup. But that would be my response to that.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Falcons have the more talented offense. The Vikings have the more talented defense. That's the simple way of doing it. And then sort of, who's second place group, the Vikings offense or the Falcons defense, would you rather have? At least in terms of a body of work, I think you probably give the Vikings the edge just because they've been a little bit more consistent and reliable than the Falcons defense has been. But I think, with the optimism that we all have with Dan Quinn taking over defense and the additions we've made to defensive line, getting that unit back up to competent levels, and potential improvements we've made in the secondary with some of those guys coming back, I wouldn't necessarily fault anybody if they took the Falcons in that regard. So, I would probably give the Falcons the edge by a hair, but this is kind of, why some of these topics about, who's more talented kind of are moot, because it's not that much of a difference between those two teams. The Falcons' strength is their offense, the Vikings' strength is defense. So they kind of negate each other. And the Vikings' offense is fine but not great, just like the Falcons' defense is fine but not great. So they kind of cancel each other out. So really, it is variables like crowd noise and home field advantage and, a guy dropping a pass there or a guy missing a tackle there, or, that wind up deciding these games more so than just sort of overwhelming these teams with talent and coaching and all these various things, and who has the best 15 plays scripted, who comes out hot, all these various things that matter, in the outcomes of these games more so than just simply we're the more talented team and we're going to show you on Sunday. But we'll sort of see. Tony Hill's question is, do you think the Falcons can make it to the Super Bowl and win it? And rise up, Shouty.
I certainly think they're a contender. We'll just have to find out. again, they have the pieces as long as, again, the offensive line reclamation project kind of works out the way we're hoping it does. I do think the defense will be better with the guys back healthy and Dan Quinn calling the shots and putting them in the right positions to be an improved unit. Certainly the pass rush is a major question still, and hopefully, again, Vic Beasley in a prove-it year is at least improved, because he can't be much worse than he's kind of been the last couple of years. And then Takk McKinley, you're hoping for that year 3 jump, and then Grady Jarrett obviously is still an ascending player, so you got a marquee player there in the middle of the defense, and then you got the guys behind them, Dion, Keanu, all the guys. So they certainly have the requisite parts to do it. It's just a matter of putting it all together on the field and getting the dubs.
Yeah. I think the Falcons have Super Bowl potential. Someone asked a similar question, sort of who our Super Bowl pick last week, and neither of us picked the Falcons. They're not the favorite in my eyes, but they certainly have the potential to get there. If you're talking about if this offense lives up to its potential and is one of the 4 or 5 best offenses in the league, if the defense lives up to its potential, finally gets realized, and they don't have to be a top 10 unit by any means. They just got to be like average to above average. And like my expectation and my hope is like, they finish somewhere in the rankings between like 14 and 18. If they hit that benchmark, that's fine for me, coupled with, a top 3, top 4 type of offense. And if they can hit that pretty consistently week in and week out, and then are able to make the playoffs, given this schedule, one of the tougher schedules in the league this season, then I think, they go into January as a battle-tested team, facing a number of teams that a lot of people are looking at as potential playoff teams, including the Vikings and the Eagles. And, I know a lot of people are writing off the Colts. I don't think people should be doing that quite yet. So I think this Falcon team, if they can go 10-6 or 11-5 with this schedule, they are a legit contender that can go toe-to-toe against any team in the NFC come January. And so, yeah, I do think they have the capability of making the Super Bowl. It's just whether or not they live up to that potential. And I think this Vikings game is, no one wants to sit here and judge a Falcons season. We've learned too often in the past years to base anything, an entire season, off of how they perform in week 1. But I do think this is a golden opportunity to get off to a good start against a tough team. And, this game could have strong playoff implications as far as tiebreakers go, because everybody, I think, certainly us in Atlanta, and I know people in Minnesota, expect both of these teams to sort of be in the driver's seat in terms of competing for a playoff spot. So this, won't be the end all be all, but this is a good litmus test to sort of see where this Falcon team is at. All right, we got a couple more. Maximus HD asks, do you think we sweep the Saints this year?
Not really. I think that's a tough ask. I think if we can split, that's really all I can ask for from that matchup, because I do think the Saints will still be relevant and still be, while I'm hoping, in the back of my head that Drew Brees does continue to show the regression we saw at the end of the year, until I see it, I'm going to still consider Saints a contender for the NFC South, for the NFC. So with that in mind, I think that the most you can ask for is a split in that series.
Yeah, I mean, am I mistaken in thinking we've only swept the Saints twice in the Drew Brees eras? Like, was it?
Yeah, I think you're right. It was 2016, right? And then
2016, 2014, and
that might have been it. Or 2012? No, 2012. They knocked us off when we were 8-0. So I think that's probably it. Yeah.
Yeah. Whatever. I'm sure you guys are yelling at your screen or at your phone with the correct answer, but basically every season I predict the Falcons to split with the Saints, and that prediction rarely steers me wrong in terms of whether or not, at least particularly when you compare it to their ability to sweep the Saints. So, yeah, I'm not going to expect that this year. Obviously, you want to see it, but it's probably the first time I'll predict that is the year that Drew Brees is no longer the Saints quarterback. But we got a couple more. B-Baller DD asks, we all know our AFC struggles these past few seasons. I know we are better than the record shows. What do you think we will do realistically against our AFC opponents?
So we got the AFC South this year, which, I would say is probably the weakest AFC division. That's my opinion, because while we shouldn't write off the Colts, I do think they take a step back. They can still be a 9-10 win football team, which kind of on par with what they were last year. But I think from a talent standpoint on the rest of their roster, I mean, they should be better. But again, they got to take a step back with Luck not being there. The Jaguars are an interesting one. I don't know what to expect really from them. They're a major wild card, but I don't think Nick Foles is going to have the type of impact that they're hoping for. I could be wrong on that. I just think, Philly's the best system for him. And really anywhere else he's been, he hasn't been that great. And then the Titans, I think Titans could be competing potentially for that number 1 spot. So I think, you could see the Falcons go 3-1 in these matchups. Houston, I believe is a home game as well, correct?
I haven't memorized the schedule.
Yeah, I think if memory serves me, I think Houston's a home game. So, I mean, that helps because that's the one that you might.
I think it's a road game because it's indoors, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think you might be right.
I think the Colts and Texans are road games, and I think the Jaguars and Titans are home games. I think.
Okay. Well, in any event, I think 3-1's a possibility. The Houston one, I think they're the best team. I think they helped themselves despite all the jokes we make with their dysfunctional front office lately. I do think they definitely helped themselves with the addition of Tunsil and Stills on offense. It could be a shootout because I think their defense does lose a bit with Clowney not being there. But yeah, I think we do kind of rid ourselves of those demons a little bit, and I think 3-1 is very much in the cards against those 4 opponents.
Yeah, I mean, look, the last time the Falcons had a winning record against the AFC was against the AFC South back in 2015. So, positive, I guess. But the last couple of years, I think they're like a combined 6-11 or something against AFC teams. So, it's pretty tough as far as this team's ability to, stumble against AFC teams for whatever reason. So, I look at that AFC South division, and while I think Houston is the favorite, you could convince me that any one of those 4 teams could win that division because I just don't trust any of those teams to play up to their potential. And so, in certain ways, you could say that makes them the weakest division, but in certain ways, I think you could also make it say that's the strongest division because they're the most number of teams that I could see having winning records this season in that AFC conference, while everybody else I think has 1 or 2 good teams at the top of the division, and the rest of the division is trash. So it'll be interesting whether or not the Falcons manage to break their sort of AFC streak this year, going up against these AFC South teams. But for me, my general expectation is they'll probably go 2-2 or something stupid like that. Obviously, they have the capability of sweeping that division, or at least having a winning record at 3-1. But knowing the Falcons, they'll find some way to lose to Jacoby Brissett and beat the Texans, and then lose to the Jaguars, Nick Foles, and beat the Titans, and it'll just be like, what is going on here? Why? But it is what it is. Let's see. Let's do one more. Since we're inching up on a 2-hour show. A Day in the Life asks, why is Dan Quinn's job on the line based off of the season? I believe he's earned a little leeway.
For me, I just think, he's really put it all on himself. It's really an all or nothing season just based on, the firings that he made and then, his promotion to D coordinator. At this point, there's nothing he can fall back on. Last year he could fall back on the injuries a little bit. And I guess he fell back on the coaching staff. In my opinion, I think he scapegoated Sark to a degree. But if they go 7-9, 8-8, what? And there's no major injuries again. What can he say? What can his excuse be that this talented roster that we kind of rave about at times on this show what's the excuse at that point? Then you got to say it's on the coaching, and I wouldn't fault Arthur Blank for not being patient, sinking all this money into Matt Ryan, into Julio Jones, into Deion Jones and Grady Jarrett and all that. I wouldn't blame him for saying, all right, well, I need to have a new guy steering this ship, because I feel like we have the players, have the pieces. It's just the coaching is that last missing element. And again, I don't want to see it happen. I tweeted this last week. I think the job that Dan Quinn and Thomas Dimitroff have done, bringing this culture, this brotherhood culture, and then obviously the way that they've drafted, finding the talent that we're talking about here has been tremendous. I mean, they've hit on more draft picks than they've missed on, and that's a lot more than we could say about the last regime. So, again, I don't want to see it happen. I don't think it's going to happen, but if it did, I think that's kind of the reason why.
No, I agree with that. For me, it's if I was the owner of the team, I don't think Dan Quinn's job would be on the line unless they really, really underachieved this season. Right now, I can't even picture what that is. But the Falcons are always down for.
Isn't underachieving though for you, like a 7-9, 8-8 season though? Because your expectation is like isn't your expectation 10 wins, 11 wins? I mean,
that's my expectation, but like it wouldn't shock me. You get a bad game or here or there against this schedule. Wouldn't shock. 8-8 isn't so bad that it's like how could this possibly happen? Again, I think this is a really tough schedule, and I think a lot of people are sort of looking at last year's schedule, which I don't think was nearly as tough. And some of these matchups, given some of the issues the Falcons are dealing with, particularly this early, again, I think 4-4, if they get to the bye week 4-4, that's great, for them. As opposed to, you drop a game here or there and boom, you're at 3-5. And then that means if you're 4-4, my expectation is they go 6-2 in the second half of the season. But you got 5 divisional games. You got a couple of sort of sneaky opponents late in the season. So, 6-2 could easily be 5-3 or 4-4. And all of a sudden you're staring at an 8-win type of season. So to me, it's not out of the realm of possibility that this team could be really good and still not having, above 500 season. So for me, like I wouldn't necessarily automatically be like, you don't make the playoffs, you got to go. But I'm not making the decision. That's Arthur Blank's decision. And again, we've talked about this a number of times this offseason. When you look historically at Arthur Blank's tenure as the owner, no coach has survived 2 consecutive non-playoff seasons. So if that trend continues, and for whatever reason, whether it's injuries, whether it's underachieving, whatever it is, just, strength of schedule, whatever it is, and the Falcons don't manage to take care of business, then it wouldn't shock me if Dan Quinn's out, but it's not necessarily a decision I think sitting here today, obviously could have a different opinion come December, come January, but sitting here today, I don't necessarily know if I would agree with that. Okay, guys, there you have it. 2-hour show in the books. Matt joked with me saying, hey, we'll probably only do like an hour this week or whatever it may be. So we'll be back next week to recap this game, talk a little bit about the Eagles game, hopefully have another guest on to help us break down the Eagles matchup. In the meantime, you guys can send in your questions using the hashtag Falcons Mailbag on Twitter. Send those tweets to myself at Falcons, as well as Matt Karoly. You see the names on the screen in front of you. I'm sure if you're listening to the show, you know exactly what our Twitter handles are, Falcons and Matt Karoly. But also check out the show's Twitter handle, Falcons PFC. Hit us up on ProFootballCentral.com where you get the links to the audio version of this show. And of course, subscribe to the Pro Football Central YouTube page. Hit that bell icon so that you know when you go live. And of course, you can also submit questions via Facebook at Falcon Central Radio as well there. Matt, anything else you want to plug before we duck out?
Nope. As I've said before, I'm still brainstorming that article once Julio Jones contract hits. So that's on the docket, just matter of time. So that'll be at Rise Up Breeder. But yeah, hopefully, we get a Julio contract this week and, everyone enjoys the game and hopefully can enjoy Falcons victory in Minnesota.
Absolutely. So guys, hopefully the Falcons take care of business week 1 and we have some positive things to talk about next week, getting you guys set for that Eagles game. So, yeah, check you out, guys, next Tuesday night, and enjoy your weekends. I know I will.